Here. Welcome back to Context. We are joined today by Bryan Rooney, head basketball coach at Cal State University, East Bay, formerly Hayward. Welcome, Coach. Thanks for being here today.
Appreciate you having me.
So let's dive into your journey that led to you being at East Bay. And if you could consider sharing what got you into this profession and how did you end up where you are now?
Well, I think probably like a lot of people that listen to your podcast was, number one, I'm a huge fan. I've been kind of listening since day one. I vividly remember kind of when we were all at home listening to Brandon Laird and Rich Shaywitz, two friends and people I respect a ton in the business. And just I was supposed to be doing dishes, which as coaches know during the pandemic, we took on some responsibilities that usually we get to kind of push off to the side because we're in the middle of the season. So what Contact's able was kind of save me some of those duties. And my wife will say that I did carry through with them ultimately. But I think just learning, I think that was a big piece of kind of part of my journey. I think like many coaches that get into it and stay into it, it was about mentors. I can vividly remember, being 9 years old and in Brinken Valley Little League and having Mel Arnrich and Greg Dunn, Ket Escobar as great influencers in my life. And that kind of started the journey, I think, along with my father of meaningful coaches. And I think as I've gone with my journey, whether it be, many, many years ago as an athlete and now progressing into the profession, that's the thing I keep coming back to is I literally learned everything about coaching from coaches that I had. And I don't think that's unique, but it's certainly something that's extremely meaningful to me. And so I have kind of a unique journey as a student athlete, as a coach, in the sense of I have experience at every single level you can think of, in the fact that, I went to St. Mary's High School and then actually played a year of college football. At that time, St. Mary's College had a football program, and now, which used to be Division I AA, which I think now they call it FCS. And so I was there for a year, and then I played junior college basketball for 2 years, and then I played at the NAI level for 2 years. And then from a coaching standpoint, coached at the NAI level, coached at Division II, coached at Division III, and then I became a head coach. And so I think all along the way in those journeys, I kept drawing back to experiences I had as a student athlete. And one of the big things that we talk about in our program is the difference between transactional and transformative. And I thought about, again, getting into coaching, what unified all of my mentors, and whether they said it or not, that's what they were to me, as they were transformative leaders. And that's something that I tried to do kind of along the way in my journey as an assistant and certainly as a head coach.
So you bring up this idea of transformative leadership as opposed to transactional. And as you've gone through your career, multiple places, this may be a dangerous question, but let's ask it anyway. Would you say, or could you say, there's a general trend at any particular level where you see more transactional approaches than transformational approaches?
Well, I think the natural one to think of is, the quote unquote higher level you go, the more transactional that it becomes or it has to be. And I haven't been at the high major level, so I can't speak with authority of that. But I think when you look at those that have been the most successful and especially sustained success, I think it's more on that spectrum of being transformative. And so I think that's the piece of it is we all are, kind of can fall victim of being very transactional in our relationships. But again, I go back to, a great mentor of mine who I know that Bill Tressler, and people ask, what was Coach Tress like? Why was he why was he successful at the different places that he's been? And I could, whether it be Brian Katz or Bill Tressler, or John Gustorf or Scott Morrison, or I could go on and on. The winning was important, but the journey along the way was way more important than what the scoreboard read. And I think that's the big piece for me with our players is making sure that they understand it. I love the fact that they keep scoring what we do. I love the fact that, at the end of the day, you have been able to measure yourself versus an opponent that's trying to beat you. But at the same time, what are the relationships and what are we investing in one another? And so I think in direct response to your question, yeah, but I think in some ways it's a cop out to say, oh, the higher level that you go, then it has to be transactional. It is at times, but it doesn't have to be.
Right. And my question was more about just trend lines, right? And what causes certain spaces to be that way. Because what you have heard on the pod and what I have been able to take away from my interviews is that in our youth, unintentionally, it tends to be much more transactional because our focus isn't always where it should be because we don't know any better. And as we mature, for the most part, we realize that the relationship piece leads to outcome versus the other way around. And so, I think you got that nailed on the head. When you first got to be a head coach and with the mentorship that you've been able to learn from, you would think that you have a lot of the things you need from a preparation standpoint to do the job. However, as most of us find out, there are some things we don't know. What were some of those things that you got hit in the face with right away, realizing that you have no idea what you're doing?
Well, it's interesting because my first head coaching opportunity was at Rubidoux High School in Riverside, and it was a JV baseball job. And I got the job basically by emergency. So at that time, I was coaching at Claremont McKenna with Ken Scalmanini in the Division III SCIAC League. Unbelievable league, great rivalries and the whole thing. And I was teaching kind of as my day job in English and also PE. And I was the only PE teacher that did not coach a sport. So I kind of tricked in terms of doing some strength and conditioning, and it allowed me to do really what I want to do coaching wise, which was coach at the college level. So anyways, the JV baseball coach, he gets fired in the middle of the season, and they come down, and the AD and the VP come down and say, hey, you ever play baseball? You have any experience in baseball? And I played in high school and, had great experiences, on the field. And they said, okay, great. Well, you're going to start tomorrow. You guys have practice at 3:30. And I said, oh, okay. I'm supposed to go recruiting. I'm not going to tell them this, but I'm supposed to go recruiting. So I got to call Coach Gallinini. And long story short, I build up and my first head coaching opportunity, and I'm fired up, and I got this big speech prepared, and I walk out, and there's like 8 kids there. Right. And so I go and I give my speech, and one of the kids stands up, real bright kid. And he goes, Coach, that sounds great, but we're never going to play. And I go, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, we're just the leftovers. All the good JV guys, they're with the varsity right now, and they travel when the varsity plays. And it was a great reminder to me that going into it, and goes to your question, is it's way more important where our players are coming from and that we meet them than whatever information schematically X's and O's. And I think that was one of my biggest, lessons in that point. But also when I became the head coach at Cal Maritime, was it informed my decisions going forward, as I had to understand where they were coming from, certainly in their careers basketball wise, but just where they were in their day. At Cal Maritime, they could be serving watch from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. and then they have class until 4, and then they have a practice for 3 hours. I have to make sure that I understand, kind of where they are in their life, whether it be the short term or the long term. So I think that's the first lesson. I think the second lesson, and you hear it all the time, is you find out very quickly, and I certainly did, that I knew very little. And in that moment, I gained a greater appreciation than I already had for the coaches that I played for, and certainly that I worked for as well. And so the little things like planning practice and making sure that there's a sequence of practice that allows, continuity and momentum to go from the first time we're doing dynamic warm up to all the way to the last whistle, and all the things in between. And so I think those are kind of my biggest takeaways of the importance of the planning process, of not just planning for the 2.5 hours of practice, but planning for the 24 hours and understanding what our players' days are about.
So I'm super intrigued by the last part, but also everything else. But I want to dive in on the second piece, planning practice. So one of the things that have come up over the years at this point, in regards to the pod, is people wanting to get more information from some of the experts in the space. Like, what does a good practice look like? And so we were talking before we got on about how this morning we practiced, and basically it turned into, look, we did layups and other variations of finishing for an hour and a half because it was a vehicle to teach communication and focus. It didn't even have to do with the layups. But, practice looked like this, and we did none of that. So at what point, as you're planning practice and you're sequencing things and you're getting ready, right? How regimented are you in sticking to that come hell or high water? And how quickly do you jettison it to focus on whatever? Where do you fall on that spectrum, and why?
Right. I think going into it, it's funny. One of the most brilliant men and people I ever known is my dad. And I remember my dad, talking about, kind of college professors, and then, going into the preparation that goes into each class. And I remember going off to college, and he said, he's taking a look at my, course load and things like that. He goes, okay, well, for every hour of class, you're going to need to spend 3 hours outside of class, just preparing for that class. And it might be a kind of a funny parallel, but I thought the same thing about when I got into planning my own practices, because I need to really make sure that, number one, from the time, that if I was going to ask, 2 hours of our players' time, then I need to spend at the minimum 3.5 hours going into that. And that can include watching film and preparing for opponents, but that's also including preparing our players individually. So I think for me, going into each practice, there has to be certain non-negotiables that we're going to get achieved that day, whether it be on the defensive end, offensive end, late game situations, whatever it might be. And so that practice might be 2.5 hours, and those non-negotiables might not be direct, if you were to look at the plan, but they have to be things that we get done. And what it's going to mean, to your point, is that means some of the stuff's going to be thrown out. That may not be as important. When we go into it, we plan it, we think it's all important. But at the end of the day, ultimately, and I look behind you and I see the picture of one of your teams. Ultimately, that's what it's about. Like, practice should not be about what the coach is getting out of it. Practice should be about what the players and ultimately the team is getting out of it. And so I think that's a big piece. And I think one of the ways that I've grown as a coach, when I first got into it and I was planning my own practices, we were super regimented. I was at Cal Maritime, and we would practice late. We'd have the 7 o'clock slot. And at that time, it's an NAI school, so there's no hour restriction. So we could go as long as we needed to go. And I think when you talk to the players, my need for how long we needed to go was much longer than their need for how long we needed to go. But I think in terms of how I've grown, it's had to be way more about our players than it is about what our coaching staff needs to accomplish that day.
I love that answer. And it leads me to another follow-up question, since you keep coming back to Maritime. And for people who listen to this that don't know what that is, I would like you to give a quick summary. But my understanding is it is essentially kind of military light, but you're learning to drive boats and things that have to do with the ocean. And what is it like to coach those players who are going to a school with that mission, right, versus somewhere else like East Bay, where it's more of a general ed type, right, university where you have people taking all kinds of different classes? And what similarities do you see and what differences do you see there?
Well, I'll kind of go forward and then come back. So when I got the East Bay job, one of the questions that came up was, well, what are you going to do different? What are you going to do different now that you're, to your point, coaching at a school that's much different? We'll kind of get into the dynamics a little bit. And the answer, and it really hasn't changed, is in many ways I had to be core to who I am as a coach, because I think if I'm trying to be somebody that I'm not, number one, the players are going to sense that, and I'm not serving them in the best way possible. So I think that's the first piece is, coaching is coaching. I don't care where it is. Environments change and dynamics can change, but ultimately I think we need to be who we are, and best, again, go back to being servant leaders to our players. So we're, at Cal Maritime, it's very much a military school without the commitment. And so it's part of the California State University system. So the students are paying, right? So they're paying to go to school, but they're standing watch, and they're having to shave and having grooming standards and wearing uniforms every single day. And so when they came to us, every single afternoon or evening, depending on, whether we had the early slot or the late slot. And it was kind of funny, not to bounce around, but I get the East Bay job and they say, Coach, I'm really sorry. You're going to get the 5 o'clock practice slot. That was the late one. I got, well, that's fantastic. I'm used to practicing from 7 to 11 o'clock at night. And so I think it's a matter of perspective of what he had. And so I think, again, when you look at the experience of Maritime, is 10 of the best years of my life, because we were able to build something very, very special. And I think one of the big things that allowed us to kind of take a jump as a program to start winning championships was, to stop making excuses that had made previously, like, we have to wear uniforms, or we've got to, do this or do that. Whereas more of a matter of, what are the obstacles for us being the most successful that we possibly can be? Can we remove those obstacles? And we found out that we could. And then when we did remove those obstacles, we found that in removing them, it added to our strengths of, maybe in recruiting, right? The funnel was a little bit smaller, but the people that you were going to get that made it kind of through that funnel, they were going to be people that were going to, and whether it be coaches or student athletes, that we really could rely on in tough times, because that's in many ways what they were living every day.
What were some of those obstacles, so that the listeners who need more tangible information rather than conceptual, that you were able to remove, that allowed you to find success there? And what are those at East Bay that you're navigating through now?
Right. So I'll give you an example. We have a conference championship game. First time we're playing conference championship at Maritime. And the standing watch. So if those are familiar, you're standing guard, right? So in 4-hour blocks. And so we had 15 guys that first year we're in a championship. And I think 3 of them had watch from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. We had another 4, I think, that had watch from midnight to 4 a.m. So they're coming to shoot around at 11 o'clock, bleary eyed, the whole thing. And so we looked at it and we said, fantastic. The team that we're playing, they were sleeping when you were up, right? The team that you were playing, they haven't had to, get up for formation 3 days a week, at 7 a.m. to, 7:20 every morning. They haven't had to make sure that they shave every single day. They haven't to make sure that their uniform is pressed every single day, but you have. And what you have been able to do in basically navigating, excuse the pun, in Maritime, but navigating those waters, is you're tougher than they are. And so what we did is we took those challenges and we tried to make it where they viewed themselves as empowered, that they were just tougher. So whether it be a game, we'd come down, we'd be in a huddle with 35 seconds left to go, have to get a stop, and just say, fellas, when you go out there, you don't need to say a word. You can just look in the guy's eyes across from you and just know that you're tougher than that guy. And more importantly, when you look in the eyes of the other 4 guys that you have on the floor with you and the guys on the bench, we're just tougher than our opponent. And was there a little bit of tricking of the mind going on? 100%. But that's what we do as coaches. And then I think in terms of, coming to East Bay, yeah, we didn't have our guys having to stand watch. We don't have our guys having to wear uniforms. They can grow their beards and hair as long as they want, right? And that's fine. But there's the obstacle of, there wasn't, when we got here, there wasn't a whole lot of tradition in terms of winning. They hadn't played in, meaningful postseason games. And so it was the same thing of whether it be our first recruiting class or the players that had, kind of stayed from year 1 to year 2. It was, there's a reason why you're here. There's a reason why I'm here. And the reason why we're here is many things, but number one is to be successful. And here's how we're going to go about it. And then in that second year, when we win 22 games, get the postseason for the first time, in shoot 30 years at the school, it was a similar deal, right? In that we were trying to empower one another and look across and say, we're just tougher than the other team at that time. And I think that's been something that's been consistent, and certainly in my 2 stops as head coach.
Love that. So let's pivot then into, what is the best thing you do in your program that you brought with you, or you picked up from Coach Tress or Gustorf or whomever, that, say down the road you're not at East Bay for whatever reason, what's going with you? Because it's so pivotal to your culture that you will do it no matter what.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. We had, go back to the transactional, transformative, like, college basketball and certainly, high school basketball in many places, it's a results business, right? So from the transaction, you got to win to keep your job. And I totally understand that. But I go back to you mentioned Coach Stress is one of his biggest strengths was he was able to make every player in the program, no matter their role, feel that their role was essential. And that was something that was super important. And so when you talk about what's one of the best things we do, I think it's time. And so for us and me, specifically, our assistants are certainly involved in this, but every single one of our players, meets with me every single week, right? And so we have an individual meeting time, and there's kind of three, spokes to the wheel, so to speak. It's number one, always life, right? How is life going? How are you? Kind of doing in terms of whether it be socially, certainly athletically, and definitely academically. But we stay on that topic a lot. And I would say as we transition, and those times, talk about non-negotiables, those times of the day. It's funny. My first year, I was hired 4 days before school started. And so we're about 6 weeks in, and my AD sends me a message and says, "Hey, Bryan, we need to meet in half an hour up in my office." And usually your boss says that, you jump and we're out of the door before it closes. And I told him, I said, "Jason, I can't meet. I'm meeting with Jawan. We have our individual meeting time." And I think he was kind of taken aback by that. I do think he appreciated in that later, appreciated even more, was that time is sacred. Our student athletes will always be the most important part of this puzzle and this journey. And so that time is sacred to me, and we want it to be sacred to them. And I think two things that we're always going to talk about, and we put it on them, is I always ask them, how can we help you better? How can I help you better? And then what question do you have for me? So they have to come into the meeting and they've got to have a preparation as well. We've got to make sure we're prepared as coaches in that meeting, but we also want to make sure that they are as well. And that question, that help can be certainly basketball wise, but what I've come to find in doing this for a number of years now is oftentimes it's not. And that oftentimes is the growth in the relationship becomes the most impactful.
Yeah, I mean, both of those are great because you're setting them up for, what do you need? How can I serve? And at the same time, what do you want to know? Right. So there's this communication transparency that is built in, that's going back and forth, hopefully through these meetings where trust is built. And then ultimately, to your point of making sure their roles are essential, those conversations about roles, while always challenging, become a little bit easier because of the trust and the foundation that you have built.
Yeah, great example. So this past weekend, we were down at Cal State LA, and Levi Strandberg, who played for me, he became a father several months ago. And as you know, you've experienced it in your career, but one of the coolest things is meeting kind of the next generation. And I think, I vividly remember conversations that he and I had and talking about kind of his journey, right, as a man, and to see him going from those times when he was trying to navigate life. He and I were just talking about, he came down, his first open gym, he came down, he left after 45 minutes. We couldn't find him. And he was out by the waterfront. He was losing his lunch, his dinner, and his breakfast from 3 weeks ago because he was so out of shape. And to see him progress now, not just a really good player for us when he played for us, but more importantly, the man and the husband and the father that he is, those are all part of we are as coaches, for better or worse. And I would say for better, we're part of their journeys. And I think it's really important, certainly for me, to never forget that.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think the weddings you go to and the texts you get of sonograms and all of those things really, help you see, even if you don't realize it, the impact that you have. So I think those are also really good, really important parts to mention for coaches that are going through it right now and wondering, like, why do I do this? And you may not get the payoff until 10 years down the road. So keep chopping wood, so to speak. What would you say? And you can take this in whatever direction you want, but as a member of a college athletic department, you have meetings with the rest of the group relatively in a normal frequency, right? And so how often have you had the chance to get in and watch not just the other basketball coach, but the other sports, right? At Maritime, at wherever wherever else you've been? You said you played baseball in high school, you coach baseball, right? It's like, what do you see transferring as you watch other sports or coaches, or if that's not in the wheelhouse that you're watching from other coaches that do basketball that you've been able to implement into your program?
That's one of the most exciting parts of the job. I think last year that was, I think, toughest for so many, and not having competition. And I missed, and we missed as a basketball program competing, but I also missed the opportunity to observe and learn from the coaches that are in our department. I think a great example, kind of in the here and now, right now, Robin Hart and her staff with our women's soccer program. She took over a couple years ago and has completely, in many ways, revolutionized that program. They won the conference championship for the first time in school history, and we talk about it with our plays, a great example. The sports, there are certainly similarities between basketball and soccer, but more importantly are the similarities in terms of the culture building of, what's important of, when you walk right now, if I were to walk across campus and I were to see the women's soccer team, there's a way that they carry themselves. They're going to look you in the eye. They're going to shake your hand. They're going to ask how your day is going. And that's a direct result of, number one, the individual she's recruited to the program, but also how she, carries herself on a daily basis. And so, we'll go out and we'll watch, we'll watch swim meets, we'll watch the soccer games, we'll obviously watch women's basketball, we'll watch the volleyball, because not only am I taking a ton from it, but I also think that our players are as well. In that success is success, and I think we sometimes we make it really complicated as coaches. But I don't think it is ultimately. Can you get a group of individuals? Yes, we want them to be talented, but that care about one another, and they can care about one another and going after a common cause. And so whether it be our swimming coach who will be up in the weight room lifting with our guys, or you talked about kind of the women's basketball, Chanel Stiers does an unbelievable job. So it's a part of my job that I love, because I'm learning all of the time.
So from that, are there things that you have implemented directly? I saw this happen and I went back the next day and tried the basketball version of that.
Yeah, it's a good example. So like our soccer team, and I never knew this, and this is just my ignorance, but they would wear on their like their polos and their travel gear, they would have the star on there. And I had no idea, what the star was. It was for a national championship, right? You win a championship. And so one of the things we did, we hired Craig Ashmore, who was an unbelievable successful high school coach, on board. And so one of the things we had him do is we had him bring in all of his West Regional, championship gear that he had back from the 80s. And so I think artifacts are important. So I think we've tried to bring that in as well. One of the things that one of our coaches does here in our department is build-ups. And so every Friday, they'll build up. So they'll say, hey, there's 2 or 3 people, you're responsible. Hey, who do you want to build up? Something that your teammate or a coach has done that you really appreciate. So that would be an example of something that we do. Again, I think empowering our players as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think often these ideas that we get by watching are really in our head, and we can't put words to them. And then, because you talked to me after the fact on one of these, it's like people hear it and they want more information. And it's like, hey, what is that? Give me something to use, right? Because often we're grasping at straws on this thing. So thanks for that. Let's think about this. So when you go back, you're 10 years at Maritime, you're an assistant before that, you're now in year 5 at East Bay.
Exactly.
And how would you say your approach has changed during that time?
Yeah, I think my biggest thing, when I got into coaching, and again, you go back to the coaches I played for, they were unbelievable in terms of delivering the fundamental aspect of it. Just extremely. Think back to Brian Katz, who recently retired from Sac State, but he was an elite and continues to be an elite level communicator fundamentally. And so when I first became a head coach, and for a number of years, that was always front of mind. But I think one of the biggest ways that I needed to develop was, how do you take the emphasis on fundamentals and then incorporate that into the whole production of a game, right? So, and I think one of the big things is getting players to understand where the fundamentals fit in how we're going to execute offensively, how we're going to execute defensively. I think sometimes as players, it's very easy to look at, hey, we're doing fundamental work right now, and then that's separate from now we're going to go and we're playing live. And I think that's one of the ways that I've grown in a way is be able to understand. It goes back to what's most important part of practice is our players. And I think sometimes for me as a coach, I would focus so much on the fundamentals. So at the end of practice, I say, okay, yeah, we were really good at pivoting today. But then all of a sudden when we got out there and we played, like we traveled 3 times, right? We weren't good on, coming to a 2-foot stop, when there was, traffic on a penetration or whatever it might be. And so I think that's the biggest way I've grown in terms of planning practice and just schematically is focusing on, yes, fundamentals will always be important, but there has to be application of those fundamentals in real life situations, when things are going live. And that's, I think, something that I'm continuing to work on.
Have you found any secrets to that application process? Because to your point, yeah, we got better at pivoting today. Yeah, we covered layups today, right? In my example, right. It's like, okay, where's the transference? What is the secret sauce for getting that to happen, be it in basketball or anything else? Like, how do you strategize for that, right? How do you take the idea of a 2-foot stop and get it to show up in competition?
I think there'll be 3. I mean, at least 3. I think one of the first things is how we communicate it to our players, and I think how we communicate to our players. The whole adage that film does not lie. Showing them, right? Showing them, and sometimes that means before practice, of going into it and saying, hey, this is where we need to get better at, so that later in practice when we're applying that fundamental, they've seen it. It's not just coach's idea. It's not just something for the passage of time during this session of practice, but more importantly, this is something that I have to get better at individually. We have to get better at collectively as a team. I think the second piece that's connected to it is scoring it, right? We have to keep scoring what we are doing. I think as players, I think we've all been there, is if we're doing something, we're in a competitive realm, right? And that's, again, goes back to that's the beauty of what we do. But if we're doing something competitively, but we're not keeping score, it's very easy for it to lose value in that moment. And maybe more importantly, going forward in terms of long lasting value. And I think the third thing, which is connected to the first 2, is there has to be ownership. So there has to be ownership with the coaches and the student athletes. We talk about a lot that, we'll ask the question, it's rhetorical. It ultimately gets rhetorical is, okay, is this an offense or defensive drill? And some guys will come back, oh, it's offensive drill, defensive drill. Well, the correct answer is always both. Because there can never become a time when we're playing competitively where we're just focusing on one area. Because if we just focus on one area, then by nature of that argument, then we're basically losing the other side, which ultimately can't happen. That's the beauty of basketball, right? There's no 40, 25 seconds in between plays. Right? You play both sides, so you got to compete.
Absolutely. I think that's a great thing to steal. Is this an offensive or defensive drill? And just let that hang for the kids, because they are going to have an answer. And the answer is it's always both, which I don't think we communicate that well all the time.
Right.
So I like that. I'm going to steal that for this afternoon. Okay. Let's think about it from this standpoint in regards to your approach now, right? This is what I've changed over the years. Players are at the center of this thing. It's about their practice, their experience, helping them get better, versus me checking a bunch of boxes. Let's take that one step further. And it doesn't have to be basketball related, but I'm always interested in this because it speaks to our ability to self-reflect and to question ourselves. And I know you do a ton of that because we've talked about it. So for the audience, what is something that you have most recently changed your mind on? Meaning, I used to be over here, and now I'm over here on this piece, and here's why.
So I'll give you 2, and the first one's a little bit abstract, and the second one hopefully a little bit more specific. So we have core values in our program, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. And one of the things that we did over the pandemic was try to give our players more ownership over those core values, because it goes back to it. If the core values are mine as the head coach, then that's not really going to work, right? Because I'm not out on the floor. I'm not one of the players. And so one of the things we did is we took each of our core values and we had our players come up with, well, what does that look like to you? Like put that into action. So when we talk about being a servant leader, and that's one of our core values, what do you think as, Justin, who's a junior accounting major on our team, what does that look like action as part of the Cal State East Bay basketball program?
Mhm.
So now it was not, hey, this is Coach Rooney's core values. These are our core values. Like
Mhm.
this is the way and the pioneer way in many ways. And so I think that's the first piece of when I got into it. It was like, okay, I've got to give these guys the core values. They've got to live them. These are our non-negotiables, but they've got to be our non-negotiables. They've got to be our way that we conduct ourselves. And there has to be, again, going back to that term, there's got to be buy-in and more importantly, ownership.
Mhm.
And I think the second piece of it, of how I've changed, is the randomization, going in terms of practice. I think that for a long time as a coach, you could come into it and you could know if it was a Monday, it was going to be an offensive warm-up day. If it was Tuesday, it was going to be defensive warm-up day, right? And there was going to be, kind of a rhythm and a routine to practice. And I think there's benefits to that. But I think the ceiling lowers if we do not, and specifically I do not, from kind of my own journey as a coach, provide that randomization of what practice is. Because I think ultimately, when players are comfortable, that their growth is stunted. We
Mhm.
want them, and when I say uncomfortable, I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that they've got to be on their toes. They've got to never know what's coming. That's a bit extreme. So we want them to have some frame of reference going into it, but they also have to feel that they're challenged. And I think the other thing too, the randomization shows players, and just feedback. Talk about the individual meetings, feedback that I've gotten from our players is it shows an intentionality from a planning purpose. For me as a coach, and
Mhm.
knowing that, hey, we hit a lull when we're doing this in practice. So how can we avoid that lull? The answer can't be, well, it's just a player's fault, right? This has to be a cohesive, and I think we've got to lead in that. And so I think that's something that I'm continuing to grow from. But from mindset standpoint, those are two areas.
Yeah, no, and I like both of those, especially the first one where I'm sitting here thinking about this afternoon and this idea of what do we stand for? And we often preach it. This is what the program has done. And we're coming off this 2-year gap, and a lot of that has been lost. And it's like, hell, why not just sit the boys down and be like, hey, what's important to you? And the second piece, what does it look like? Right. Which I don't think we give them enough opportunity to flush that stuff out, which then now you have them to hold accountable. Remember this? You said this. Are you living up to this? And it's very different than us just coming down on them because of whatever expectation we have. So those are both great. Um, let's do this. We're going to do two things. One, going all the way back to when you got your start, what short piece of advice would you have for yourself? And then secondly, given that advice, what advice do you have for yourself for the coming week, given everything we've just reflected on?
Yeah, I think the first piece of it is I would pay better attention to the roles of administrators in
Mm.
programs. One of the things that we talk about, and that I've talked about before, with our staff is I've taken over two programs, and in those two programs, and even go back as an assistant, one of the things I found is you really can group individuals on campus into three areas. In that there's going to be a group they're going to be with you, come hell or high water. They're going to support you, number one, because maybe they like basketball,
Mhm.
or you had a good impression on them, or they know somebody
Mhm.
or whatever it is. Then you're going to have people, for whatever reason, they're not going to ever support basketball or athletics or men's basketball specifically. And so I think in those first two groups, I think I have to make sure, and I didn't totally understand this at the beginning, but I've got to validate, I've got to support, I've got to champion that first group. And in that second group, which is the third group, right? I've got to make sure they don't hurt us, right? So I've got to do whatever I can to make sure that I'm a roadblock for them getting to our student athletes, negatively, or to our staff. And then the final group, which is what I call the middle group, is those are the people that are on the fence. And I don't want to say they're the most important, because you can probably say that first group that's going to support you no matter what. That's got to be a group we don't take for granted. But that middle group's really important. And I think for me, understanding the role of administrators and how important that is. Just from an education standpoint, I got my first head coaching job, I think 26, 27, whatever it might be. And I had no idea. I just thought I'm going to show up, I'm going to coach, I'm going to recruit, I'm going to game plan. But who you have as an AD, who you have as a president is extremely important. But also the relationships that we build with the individuals in those positions are super important. But your assistant athletic directors are essential. Who is, the equipment manager, whatever it might be. So I think that would be the first piece in going back. And the second thing is, it may seem kind of funny, but my wife is great at this, but it's taking pictures. If I look back and say, okay, what am I going to do over the next several weeks? I'm going to take pictures because one of the, I referenced him a little bit earlier, but kind of it's front of mind here. But the picture with Levi Strandberg, Lincoln Strandberg, his son, and myself. Like that's right now. I can close my eyes. I can see that picture imprinted on me. But I'm going to get older, and my memory is going to go. And I got to make sure that I'm always remembering, those great memories that we have. So our guys might get annoyed from it over the next 2 weeks, but I'm going to be taking pictures because you go back to the most important thing that we do, in my opinion, is relationships. And remembering those is hugely important.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's funny as you have kids, right? At least when I go back into the files, your first kid, you've got gigabytes of photos. And then the subsequent children, it's just like, and so this complex gets developed, and it's not intentional, but it's like the novelty of having the first kid is worn off to a certain degree, and not in a bad way, but you just documenting everything, single thing. It's like, I've seen this movie, I've been here before. So right. I think, the longer we get into coaching, it's like, we've done this before, but as you crest and you start coming down the other side, it's like, man, what happened to all those middle groups? We need to get some of those photos. So reminder for all of you, document and stay in touch with people. All right, I do have one last thing for you, and this will be a little bit longer episode, but who cares? You brought in a bunch of people to speak during our time away. You had a year off from your guys. You couldn't meet in person. You had to meet on Zoom. Then you could meet in person. But what would you say if you could identify 2 or 3 takeaways that were transformational for you that have been implemented now that you have returned, that came out of those calls, those guest speakers, those things that you were just seeking ways to try to keep the kids engaged, and as a result, you were able to upgrade, so to speak, some of the things you were doing?
Well, I think the first piece of what that allowed us to do was it allowed us to engage across the spectrum of our student athletes' experiences, right? So oftentimes when we think about we're going to bring a guest speaker in, we're going to bring in somebody motivational, or maybe somebody that has experience in a specific field. So in this case, men's basketball. But what that allowed us to do is to go way beyond that, right? So to bring in somebody like yourself from a leadership standpoint, to bring somebody like, my brother Kevin in that we brought in, he's, connected to law enforcement, to bring in, community service and anywhere along the line. And so I think what it allowed us to do was it allowed us to kind of deepen the relationship piece of it. Because I think as coaches, we can tell our players all the time and say, I'm really interested in what's going on with your life. I really want to help you, grow and be part of your journey. But what do we spend the most time on? We spend the most time on basketball, right? And all that's well and good. But what that year, give or take, allowed us to do was to show them and say, okay, no, I really do care about, where you are professionally 5 years from now. Bringing in an agent who's, it represents players, and a lot of these guys want to play professionally. Great. Well, here's the journey of it. It's not just me telling you to go. Bring in somebody that, deals with, finances. Okay. What is it? What does your credit score mean? How do you build your credit score? So now all of a sudden it becomes more real life. So now when I have a conversation with one of our players, I think it allows us to go a little bit deeper because, they've had the opportunity to see that, there's more invested than just how well I shoot the ball. And I think the other piece of it too, which I think is connected to our players, but it's a great example that people want to help. Literally every person that I asked to come on, including yourself, the answer was always yes. And I think it's a great lesson for me, and it's a great lesson for certainly our student athletes to understand that people want to help, but sometimes for whatever reason, we don't always ask. And I think putting ourselves out there to ask and then also being willing that when we are asked to say yes, because there's people that want to ask, and there's people that are thrilled when we do say yes. And so I think those are some really, really good takeaways for us.
Love that. Great place to stop. If people want to come check out a game, Coach, where can they find information about the Pioneers?
Yeah, we'd love to have you. So you can go on our website, eastbaypioneers.com. You can contact me directly through my email, just brian.rooney@csueastbay.edu. My cell phone number, call me, text me, whatever it might be, all hours of the night. My wife doesn't love it when I always pick up, but that's kind of part we sign up for. It's 415-259-7106. Really appreciate you having me on.
Awesome, Coach. Talk soon. Good luck this coming week with your games.
Thanks again. Take care.